The rain hammered against the windows of my craftsman house in Selwood, each drop a small fist demanding attention. Inside, the smell of cinnamon rolls mixed with the sound of teenagers arguing over bathroom time. A chaos I'd learned to find beautiful over 10 years of unexpected motherhood. Lily was reminding Noah for the third time that he'd left his art supplies scattered across the kitchen counter, while Sophie narrated the entire exchange like a sports commentator, and Ben hummed a song he'd learned in music class, oblivious to it all. This was my life now, the one I'd built from the wreckage my brother Derek left behind when he walked out a decade ago with nothing but a duffel bag and a promise to send money that never came. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was 26 then, working entry-level at an accounting firm, living in a studio apartment barely big enough for one person, let alone 5. Now I stood in a home we'd made together, watching Lily help Ben tie his shoes before school. And I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd survive the hardest parts. Then my phone buzzed with a message that shattered that illusion in 6 words. We need to talk about my children. The morning Derek left, the sky over Portland had been the color of steel wool, gray and heavy with the kind of rain that doesn't so much fall as hang in the air like a curtain. I remember because I'd been standing at the window of my studio apartment on Hawthorne, watching the street below turn to dark mirrors, when my phone rang at 5 in the morning. It was Patricia, my mother, and her voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. The kind that comes when the foundation of something you've built your entire life around suddenly reveals itself to be sand. She told me Derek had left a note on the kitchen table. Something about Los Angeles and a music opportunity he couldn't pass up. About needing to find himself before he could be the father his kids deserved. The note was 3 paragraphs long, she said, but it might as well have been 3 words. I'm not coming back. When I arrived at my parents' house in Milwaukee that morning, the scene inside looked like the aftermath of a storm that had blown through a single room. Lily, who was 6 then, sat on the couch holding 2-year-old Sophie, rocking her with a competence no 6-year-old should possess. 4-year-old Noah had built a fort out of couch cushions and was hiding inside it, and baby Ben, only 3 months old, screamed in his carrier with the kind of fury that comes from sensing the world has fundamentally changed. Patricia moved through the house like a woman underwater, picking up toys and setting them down in the same spot, while Robert sat at the kitchen table with Derek's note spread in front of him like evidence at a crime scene. The paper was standard line notebook paper, the kind Derek had used in high school to write lyrics he swore would make him famous. His handwriting slanted to the right, hurried and careless, and reading it felt like watching someone I'd known my entire life become a stranger in the space between one sentence and the next. Derek had always been the one our parents worried about in that specific way parents worry when they see potential mixed with instability. He played guitar well enough to make people stop and listen at open mic nights, sang with a rawness that felt authentic even when the lyrics weren't, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that made strangers believe he was already successful rather than perpetually on the verge of it. Growing up, I'd been the steady one, the daughter who brought home report cards worth putting on the refrigerator, who worked part-time jobs through college and graduated with a degree in accounting because I understood numbers in a way that felt like speaking a native language. Derek barely graduated high school, spent 2 years at community college before dropping out, and moved through jobs the way some people move through fashion trends, enthusiastically at first, then with growing disinterest until something shinier caught his attention. Our parents had different reactions to our different paths. Patricia worried about Derek's lack of direction but praised his artistic soul. Robert admired my practicality but sometimes looked at me like he wished I'd take more risks. The result was a childhood spent in parallel universes under the same roof. Derek getting encouragement for dreams while I got appreciation for achievements, and neither of us getting quite what we needed. When Derek's girlfriend disappeared 2 weeks after Ben was born, leaving nothing but a text message saying she couldn't do this anymore, our parents had stepped in without hesitation. They were both retired by then, Patricia from 30 years as a nurse at Providence, Robert from a career with the Postal Service that had given him a pension and a bad knee. They turned their guest room into a nursery, bought a van big enough for car seats, and reorganized their entire lives around 4 children who needed stability more than they needed grandparents who could spoil them and send them home. Derek stayed for 3 months after his girlfriend left, long enough to establish a pattern of late nights and missed mornings, of promising to be home for dinner and showing up after the kids were asleep, of talking about gigs that would change everything while Patricia paid for diapers and formula. The note he left suggested he'd be gone for 6 months, maybe a year, just long enough to get established in Los Angeles, to make connections and build something real. He'd send money, he wrote. He'd call every week. He'd come back when he had something to offer them, when he could be the father they deserved rather than the disappointment he was becoming. That was 10 years ago, and in all that time Derek sent exactly 4 checks, totaling less than $3,000, and called on the kids' birthdays with the irregularity of someone who had to be reminded the dates existed. The first year I told myself he needed time, that finding yourself was a real thing people did and sometimes it took longer than expected. The second year I started documenting everything, keeping a journal with dates and amounts, scanning every piece of paper related to the kids, building a file I told myself was just for organization but knew deep down was armor against a future I couldn't quite see but sensed approaching. By the third year, I'd gone to court and filed for legal guardianship, a process that required proving Derek had abandoned his parental responsibilities and wasn't coming back. He didn't contest it, didn't even respond to the court summons. The judge granted my petition with a sympathy in her eyes that made me want to cry right there in the courtroom, but I held it together until I got to my car, and then I sat in the parking garage of the Multnomah County Courthouse and sobbed for 20 minutes while rain pounded the windshield. Taking 4 children when you're 26 and single, and living in a studio apartment requires a kind of mathematics that goes beyond numbers. I had to calculate not just finances but futures, not just immediate needs but long-term consequences. My parents offered to keep the kids living with them, but Patricia's health was already declining, her knees giving out after decades of hospital shifts, and Robert's patience, while vast, had limits that became visible when Ben cried for 3 hours straight with colic. They could help, they said, but they couldn't do it alone, not for years, not for the long stretch of childhood that remained. So I moved into their house for 6 months, sleeping on the couch while I saved every dollar from my accounting job, worked overtime whenever it was offered, and hunted for a house big enough for 5 people that I could afford on a salary designed for one. Jordan, who I'd been dating for only 8 months when Derek left, could have walked away with every justification in the world. Instead, Jordan showed up every evening after work, helped with homework and bedtime routines, and never once made me feel like the kids were an obstacle to our relationship, rather than simply part of it. The house in Selwood had been a foreclosure, a 1920s craftsman with good bones and cosmetic damage that made it affordable. The kitchen cabinets were water damaged, the bathroom tile was cracked, and the hardwood floors looked like they'd hosted a decade of dogs with long nails. But the structure was solid and there were 4 bedrooms and a backyard big enough for the kids to play in. I bought it with a first-time homebuyer program and a loan that made my accountant brain wince at the interest rate, then spent 2 years of weekends renovating it room by room, learning to tile and paint and install cabinet hardware through YouTube videos and trial and error. Jordan moved in after a year, bringing power tools and a patient teaching style that made home improvement feel less like disaster management and more like building something intentional. The kids adapted the way children do, with a resilience that broke my heart even as it gave me hope. Lily became my second in command, the one who could make lunches and help. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With homework and remember which kid had which activity on which day. Noah retreated into art, filling sketchbooks with images that were sometimes beautiful, and sometimes disturbing but always honest. Sophie became fiercely protective of Ben, positioning herself between him and any perceived threat, whether that was a bully at school or a stranger at the grocery store who looked at us too long. And Ben, who had no memory of Derek at all, simply grew up knowing me as the person who showed up every single day without exception. The years accumulated in layers, each one adding weight and texture to the life we'd built. First days of school and lost teeth, science fair projects and soccer games, the chicken pox that moved through all 4 kids like a slow-moving plague. Christmases where I maxed out credit cards to make sure there were presents under the tree. Summers at the coast where we rented a cabin for a week and pretended we were a normal family. I watched them change from children who'd been abandoned into young people who were loved, who knew they were loved, who expected to be loved because it had become the baseline of their existence. Lily started talking about college, about studying education because she wanted to be the kind of teacher who noticed when kids were struggling. Noah got accepted into an arts magnet program at Madison High School and spent hours in the garage we'd converted into a studio, painting canvases that covered the walls like windows into his interior world. Sophie joined every team sport available and brought home participation trophies she displayed with the same pride as if they were Olympic medals. Ben learned to play piano and filled the house with music that was sometimes painfully amateur and sometimes startlingly beautiful. My career progressed in the steady way careers do when you show up consistently and do good work without drama. I made senior accountant, then accounting manager, then director of finance for a mid-sized firm downtown near Pioneer Square. The salary increases came with more responsibility but also more flexibility, the ability to leave early for school events, to work from home when someone was sick, to build a life that accommodated the reality of raising 4 humans who needed me in different ways at different times. Patricia and Robert remained constants in the kids' lives, showing up for birthdays and holidays, taking them for weekends when Jordan and I needed a break, offering the kind of grandparent love that didn't have to carry the weight of primary caretaking. They never criticized Derek out loud to the kids, but I saw the disappointment in their eyes every time one of the children asked about their father, every birthday that passed without a call, every Christmas with no gift or card. Money came in from Derek so irregularly it was almost worse than nothing, because each check arrived with a note promising more, promising consistency, promising change that never materialized. $300 when Lily started kindergarten, $500 when Noah had his tonsils out, $800 when Sophie needed braces. Nothing for Ben, ever. As if the youngest child had been erased from Derek's memory along with his responsibilities. I deposited each check and added it to the spreadsheet I maintained, documenting every dollar alongside every missed birthday call, every broken promise, every absence. Jordan asked me once why I kept such meticulous records, and I couldn't fully articulate the answer except to say that I needed to remember, needed proof that this was real and not some distortion of my own perception. I needed to know that if Derek ever came back, if he ever challenged the life I'd built for these kids, I had evidence of exactly who had shown up and who hadn't. Sunday brunches at Patricia's house had become a tradition over the years, a way of maintaining family connection even as the kids grew older and their schedules became more complicated. Patricia made her famous Dutch baby pancakes, Robert brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and we'd gather around the dining table that had been in the family for 3 generations, talking over each other in the comfortable chaos of people who knew they were safe with each other. It was at one of these brunches, on a gray November morning with rain streaking the windows and the smell of cinnamon and butter filling the air, that Derek walked back into our lives like he'd never left. He didn't knock. Just used the key he apparently still had, walked through the front door with a woman I'd never seen before, and stood in the entrance to the dining room like an actor making a stage entrance. He looked older, his hairline receding, his face thinner, but he wore expensive clothes and an expression of confidence that seemed to exist independent of whether it was justified. The table went silent in the way spaces do when something fundamental has been disrupted. Lily's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Noah's eyes went wide then narrow. Sophie instinctively moved closer to Ben, whose face showed nothing but confusion because he was looking at a stranger who somehow made everyone else stop breathing. Patricia's hand trembled as she set down her coffee cup. Robert stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that felt aggressive in the silence. Jordan's hand found mine under the table, a pressure point of stability in a moment that felt like the floor was tilting. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stare at my brother who I hadn't seen in a decade, who had missed everything, who had left us to build this life without him and was now standing here like his absence had been an intermission rather than an abandonment. The woman beside him stepped forward, extending her hand with a smile that belonged in a corporate boardroom. She introduced herself as Vanessa Sterling, and even her name sounded expensive, polished, like something carefully selected for maximum impact. She wore designer clothes that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, carried herself with the assurance of someone who'd never been told no, and looked at the children like they were interesting artifacts in a museum rather than human beings with a decade of life lived without the man standing beside her. Derek finally spoke. His voice the same but somehow different, flatter, more rehearsed. He said he knew this was unexpected, that he should have called first, that there was so much to explain and so much he needed to make right. He said he'd changed, that he'd gotten his life together, that he was ready now to be the father he should have been all along. He said these things while looking at the kids with an expression I couldn't read, something between longing and calculation, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach, a warning that this moment wasn't what it appeared to be. Patricia recovered first, her nursing training kicking in even when her emotions were in freefall. She stood and gestured toward the empty chairs at the table, her voice trembling only slightly as she offered coffee and breakfast. Derek accepted with the ease of someone who expected hospitality regardless of circumstance, while Vanessa surveyed the dining room with an expression that managed to convey both interest and subtle judgment. She complimented the vintage furniture, the way Patricia had arranged the family photos on the wall, but her tone carried an undertone that suggested she was cataloging flaws rather than admiring charm. Derek sat down between Lily and Noah, reaching out to touch Lily's shoulder in a gesture that made her flinch so subtly I might have been the only one who noticed. He asked about school, about what grade she was in now, and the fact that he had to ask that he didn't know his own daughter was a junior in high school seemed to escape him entirely. Noah said nothing, his jaw tight, his hands gripping his fork like it was the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Sophie stared at Derek with the kind of intensity that made adults uncomfortable, her protective instincts on high alert even if she couldn't articulate why. Ben looked between all of us, trying to read the room, to understand why the air had become so thick it was hard to breathe. Jordan squeezed my hand harder, a silent question about whether I wanted to leave, to take the kids and walk out, but I couldn't move. I needed to hear what Derek had come to say, needed to understand what had brought him back after all this time. Robert remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest, his postal worker's practicality asserting itself in the form of waiting for facts before responding with emotion. He asked Derek directly what he wanted, why he'd come back now, and the question hung in the air with the weight of a decade's worth of silence. Derek launched into a prepared speech that had clearly been rehearsed, possibly in front of a mirror, possibly with Vanessa coaching him on tone and pacing. He talked about Los Angeles, about how hard he'd worked to establish himself in the music industry, about the struggles and setbacks that had kept him from being able to come back sooner. He said he'd thought about the kids every day, that not being with them had torn him apart, but he'd needed to become someone worthy of being their father before he could return to their lives. He talked about therapy and self-reflection, about confronting his demons and emerging stronger, about meeting Vanessa and finding the stability he'd always lacked. Vanessa nodded along, her hand on his arm, playing the role of supportive partner with the skill of someone who understood that appearances mattered more than authenticity. Derek said he'd achieved success now, that he had resources and stability, that he was ready to be present in a way he hadn't been capable of before. He said he wanted to rebuild relationships with his children, to be part of their lives again, to make up for lost time. The words sounded reasonable on the surface, the kind of redemption narrative people wanted to believe in, but they landed wrong like puzzle pieces forced into spaces they didn't fit. Lily spoke for the first time. Her voice steady despite the tremor I could hear underneath. She asked him where he'd been for her 16th birthday 6 months ago, for Noah's art show last spring, for Sophie's championship soccer game, for Ben's piano recital. She asked these questions without anger, just genuine curiosity about how someone could claim to think about them every day while missing every significant moment of their lives. Derek's face tightened, a flash of irritation breaking through the carefully constructed humility. He said he'd sent cards, that he'd tried to call but the numbers he had didn't work anymore, that he'd been blocked from reaching out. This was a lie and we all knew it was a lie, but Vanessa jumped in smoothly, talking about how complicated family situations could become, how miscommunication could create barriers that weren't anyone's fault, really just unfortunate circumstances that needed to be overcome. Patricia brought out more food, a reflexive response to tension, and the act of serving gave her something to do with her hands while her mind tried to process what was happening. She asked Derek if he was planning to stay in Portland, if this was a visit or something more permanent. Derek exchanged a look with Vanessa that communicated something I couldn't quite read, then said they'd actually moved to Lake Oswego 2 weeks ago, that they'd bought a house there, a place with enough room for the kids to visit, to stay over, to gradually transition into spending more time with him. The word transition made my stomach clench. Robert asked what he meant by that, his voice hard now, the patience wearing thin. Derek said he wanted shared custody, that he'd consulted with lawyers and understood his parental rights, that he'd made mistakes but he'd never terminated his rights and therefore was still legally their father. Vanessa added that they'd researched Oregon family law extensively, that they understood the process for modifying custody arrangements, that they weren't trying to disrupt anything but simply wanted to exercise Derek's rightful role in his children's lives. The room temperature seemed to drop, or maybe it was just my blood going cold. I found my voice finally, asking Derek if he was seriously suggesting that he could walk back in after 10 years and demand custody of children he'd abandoned, children who didn't know him, children who'd built lives that didn't include him because he'd chosen not to be part of them. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd seen throughout our childhood, a resentment that I'd always been the one who succeeded by conventional standards while he'd been the one with unrealized potential. He said he appreciated everything I'd done, that he was grateful I'd stepped in when he couldn't, but temporary guardianship didn't change the fact that he was their father. He said it was time for things to return to their natural order, for him to take his rightful place in their lives. Vanessa reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a folder, setting it on the table like evidence. She said they'd prepared a proposal for gradual integration, starting with supervised visits and building toward overnights and eventually a formal custody split. Lily pushed back from the table abruptly, her chair scraping loud in the silence. She said she was 16, almost 17, old enough in Oregon to have a voice in custody decisions, and her voice was that she didn't want this, didn't want visits with a stranger who happened to share her DNA, didn't want her life disrupted by someone who'd never bothered to be part of it when disruption might have actually mattered. Noah followed her lead, standing up and saying he had nothing to say to someone who'd missed every important moment of his life, and now wanted credit for showing up when it was convenient. Sophie grabbed Ben's hand, pulling him up with her, and told Derek in a voice that shook with anger that he didn't get to call himself their father, that fathers showed up, that fathers were there for soccer games and homework and nightmares, and he'd been none of those things. Ben looked confused but followed his siblings as they left the dining room, their footsteps heavy on the stairs, the sound of bedroom doors closing like punctuation marks on their verdict. Derek's carefully composed expression cracked, anger seeping through. He stood up, his voice rising as he said they'd been poisoned against him, that I'd spent 10 years turning them against him, filling their heads with lies about abandonment when the truth was he'd been trying to build a better life for them. Patricia tried to intervene, her voice shaking as she said that wasn't fair, that I'd never spoken ill of him to the kids, that they'd come to their own conclusions based on his absence rather than anyone's words. Derek ignored her, his focus entirely on me now, his finger pointing across the table as he accused me of stealing his children, of manipulating the situation to cut him out, of using his temporary absence to permanently replace him in their lives. The word temporary would have been funny if it weren't so insulting, as if 10 years was just a brief intermission in parenthood. Robert stepped between us, his voice commanding in a way I rarely heard, telling Derek that he needed to calm down, that accusations weren't going to solve anything, that if he wanted to rebuild relationships with his kids, he needed to start by respecting the reality of what those 10 years had meant. Vanessa stood as well, her composure never slipping, and suggested that perhaps emotions were running too high for productive conversation, that maybe it would be better to continue this discussion with lawyers and mediators present. She said this like it was a reasonable suggestion rather than a threat, like bringing legal force into family dynamics was just practical planning. Derek grabbed the folder off the table, his hands shaking with either rage or something else I couldn't identify, and said he'd tried to do this the easy way, tried to be reasonable and respectful, but if that's how we wanted to play it, fine. He had lawyers too, and they'd assured him he had every right to his children. The possessive pronoun made my skin crawl. Jordan finally spoke, voice calm but steely, saying that if Derek wanted to involve lawyers, we'd be happy to provide documentation of every missed birthday, every unpaid support obligation, every broken promise over the last decade, and we'd let a judge decide who'd acted in the children's best interests. They left shortly after that, Derek's exit lacking the dramatic entrance's polish, Vanessa guiding him out with a hand on his back like he was the victim in this scenario rather than the architect of his own absence. The door closed behind them and the house seemed to exhale, releasing tension that had made the walls feel closer together. Patricia sat down heavily, her face pale, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee cup. Robert paced the length of the dining room, his jaw working like he was chewing through thoughts too bitter to swallow. Jordan pulled me close and I realized I was shaking, my whole body vibrating with adrenaline and fear, and an anger so deep it felt like it originated in my bones. I needed to check on the kids, needed to make sure they were okay, but I also needed a moment to put myself back together, to figure out what had just happened and what it meant for the life we'd built so carefully over the last 10 years. The kids had congregated in Lily's room, the four of them sitting on her bed in a configuration that reminded me of that first morning 10 years ago, when they clustered together against uncertainty. I knocked softly before entering, giving them the courtesy of choice about whether they wanted to talk. Lily looked up at me with eyes that were trying not to cry, and that restraint broke something in me because she shouldn't have had to be strong, shouldn't have had to protect her siblings from their own father's inadequacy. I sat on the edge of the bed and they gravitated toward me like planets to a sun, Sophie tucking herself under my arm, Ben climbing into my lap despite being almost too big for it, Noah leaning against my shoulder, Lily gripping my hand like it was a lifeline. Nobody spoke for a long time. We just sat there in the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked windows, holding on to each other while the foundation of our world shifted beneath us. Sophie asked the question they were all thinking, whether Derek could actually take them away, whether a judge would force them to live with someone they didn't know. I wanted to tell her no, wanted to promise that would never happen, but I'd learned over 10 years that lying to children about things that mattered only made things worse when the truth revealed itself. I told them honestly that I didn't know what Derek could legally do, that family law was complicated and parental rights were taken seriously even when parents hadn't exercised those rights responsibly. But I also told them that they had voices, that their ages and their preferences mattered, that no judge would ignore what they wanted or force them into a situation that would harm them. I told them we'd fight, that Jordan and I and their grandparents would fight with everything we had, that we'd document and prove and advocate until there was nothing left to argue. I told them they were safe, that our home was their home, that 10 years of love and presence counted for something no matter what Derek claimed. Noah asked why Derek had come back now after all this time, and I didn't have a good answer because I didn't fully understand it myself. Lily said she thought it had something to do with Vanessa, the way she'd looked at them like they were accessories rather than people, the way she talked about the house in Lake Oswego with enough room for kids like they were furniture being arranged for optimal aesthetic. Sophie said Derek hadn't even known what grades they were in, hadn't asked about their interests or their friends or their lives, had just talked about himself and his journey and his readiness. Ben, who'd been quiet through all of this, asked in a small voice if it was his fault, if Derek had left because he'd been a baby and babies were too much work. The question shattered me because Ben had lived his entire conscious life without his father, and was still somehow taking responsibility for that absence. I pulled him closer and told him with as much certainty as I could muster that nothing about Derek's choices had been his fault, that he'd been a baby and babies needed care and fathers who left babies weren't leaving because of the babies but because of something broken in themselves. We stayed in Lily's room for over an hour, talking through fears and anger and confusion, letting the kids process in their own ways and at their own pace. Eventually Sophie said she was hungry, which was her default response to emotional overwhelm, and we migrated back downstairs to find Patricia had stress-baked 3 dozen cookies and Robert had made sandwiches nobody would eat but everyone appreciated the gesture. Jordan had been making phone calls, reaching out to the lawyer we'd used for the guardianship paperwork 10 years ago, leaving messages with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that action was the antidote to helplessness. Mia Rodriguez, my best friend since college and the kids' honorary aunt, showed up without being called because Patricia had texted her and she dropped everything to be there. She brought ice cream and hugs and the kind of practical support that came from having witnessed our entire decade-long journey. That night, after the kids had finally gone to bed and Jordan had fallen asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of our bedroom, listening to the rain that never seemed to stop in November Portland. I thought about Derek's face across that dining table, the calculation behind his concern, the way he delivered rehearsed lines about redemption while threatening legal action in the same breath. I thought about Vanessa and her designer clothes and her research into family law, the way she guided the conversation like a conductor directing an orchestra toward a predetermined conclusion. Something about their presentation felt off, too polished, too prepared, like they'd anticipated resistance and planned for it. Derek had never been that organized in his life, had always operated on impulse and charm rather than strategy. Someone was coaching him, helping him build a case, and I suspected it was Vanessa with her corporate competence and her clear vision of what she wanted their life to look like. The question that kept me awake was why? Why now, after 10 years of silence punctuated by occasional guilt checks? What had changed? Derek hadn't suddenly developed paternal instincts after a decade of not exercising them. People didn't transform from absent to engaged without reason, without catalyst. I pulled out my phone and started searching, typing Derek's name into Google along with Los Angeles and music, and anything else I could think of that might reveal what he'd actually been doing all this time. What I found was interesting in its absence. No music credits, no producer listings, no evidence of the career he claimed to be building. What I did find after digging through social media and public records was a bankruptcy filing from 3 years ago, a string of addresses suggesting frequent moves, and finally 6 months ago, the first appearance of Vanessa Sterling in his Instagram photos, always in expensive locations, always styled like money was unlimited. I searched Vanessa's name and found much more. She was an executive at a tech company, came from family money in Seattle, had been married once before and divorced without children. Her social media presented a life of travel and luxury and carefully curated experiences, the kind of existence that looked perfect in photographs, but revealed nothing about the person behind them. The most recent post showed Derek, always in nice clothes he couldn't have afforded on his own, always in settings that screamed Vanessa's income bracket rather than his. There were captions about building a family, about second chances, about creating the life they both deserved. The timeline suggested they'd been together less than a year, and she was already talking about family and children and futures. I screenshot everything, saving it to a folder I labeled with the date, adding it to the documentation I'd been keeping for 10 years like I'd somehow known this moment would come. Jordan woke up around 3 in the morning to find me still on my phone, the glow illuminating my face in the dark room. I showed them what I'd found, walking through the timeline and the discrepancies between what Derek had claimed and what the evidence suggested. Jordan listened with the careful attention of someone trained to analyze patterns, their background in data analysis making them see connections I might have missed. They pointed out that Vanessa's divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, right around the time she'd met Derek, and that her social media posts about family and children had started immediately after. They suggested carefully that maybe this wasn't about Derek wanting his kids back so much as Vanessa wanting a ready-made family and Derek being willing to provide one as his contribution to their relationship. It made a horrible kind of sense, the idea that we were dealing not with a father's redemption, but with a woman's desire for an instant family, and a man willing to leverage his abandoned children to secure his financial future. The next morning I called the lawyer, James Whitmore, from the parking lot of my office building before going inside. He remembered our case from 10 years ago, remembered the guardianship filing and Derek's lack of response, and listened carefully as I explained what had happened at Sunday brunch. His silence after I finished speaking lasted long enough that I thought we'd been disconnected, but finally he sighed and said this was more complicated than I probably wanted to hear. He explained that while Derek had abandoned his responsibilities, he'd never terminated his parental rights, which meant legally he was still the children's father with all the rights that entailed. The guardianship I held was powerful but not absolute, and if Derek petitioned for custody modification, a court would have to consider it. However, James said, the children's ages worked in our favor, particularly Lily being 16 and the others being old enough to clearly express their preferences. The decade of abandonment worked in our favor. The lack of financial support worked in our favor. The stability we provided worked in our favor. But he wouldn't lie to me and say this would be easy or guaranteed. He asked me to compile everything I had, every document, every record, every piece of evidence showing the last 10 years in detail. He wanted school records showing my involvement in Derek's absence, medical records with the same pattern, financial records showing every dollar I'd spent and every dollar Derek hadn't, character witnesses who could testify to the kids' well-being and their relationships with me versus their lack of relationship with Derek. He wanted the journal I'd been keeping, the spreadsheet of missed birthdays and broken promises, the screenshots from social media I'd taken last night. He said we needed to build not just a legal case but a narrative, a story that would make it impossible for any judge to see Derek as anything other than what he was, someone whose rights existed on paper but whose responsibilities had been abdicated so completely that those rights had become meaningless. James said to give him a week to review everything and research precedents, and then we'd meet to discuss strategy. I spent that week in a strange dual existence, going through the motions of normal life while simultaneously living in a heightened state of awareness that everything could change at any moment. I went to work and reviewed financial statements and attended meetings, but part of my brain was always calculating, always running scenarios, always preparing for battle. At home, I tried to maintain normalcy for the kids while also being honest about what we were facing. We had family meetings where everyone got to express their fears and their anger and their questions. We talked about worst-case scenarios and best-case scenarios and everything in between. Lily researched emancipation laws, trying to figure out if she could legally choose to stay with me regardless of what a court decided. Noah filled sketchbooks with images that were darker than usual, processing through art what he couldn't articulate in words. Sophie became even more protective of Ben, barely letting him out of her sight, as if proximity could shield him from whatever was coming. Ben started having nightmares, waking up crying about being taken away, and I'd sit with him until he fell back asleep, singing the same songs I'd sung when he was a baby and I was barely more than a kid myself. Jordan took on more of the household management, making sure everyone ate and got to school and had clean clothes, handling the logistics of daily life so I could focus on building our defense. Mia came over most evenings, bringing takeout and moral support, and occasionally just sitting with me in silence when words felt inadequate. Patricia and Robert provided backup childcare and emotional support, though I could see the toll this was taking on them, the way it was forcing them to confront their own feelings about their son's choices, and their role in enabling those choices over the years. Robert admitted one evening, his voice thick with regret, that maybe they'd made it too easy for Derek to be irresponsible, that their desire to protect him from consequences had ultimately protected him from growth. Patricia cried and said she thought she was being a good mother by believing in his potential, but maybe belief without accountability was just another form of harm. The documentation process was overwhelming in its thoroughness. I pulled every school form I'd ever signed, every parent-teacher conference note, every report card and permission slip and emergency contact sheet. I compiled medical records from pediatrician visits and dental checkups and emergency room trips, highlighting my name on every form, the absence of Derek's name a pattern so consistent it told its own story. I printed bank statements showing tuition payments and grocery expenses and clothing costs, mortgage statements showing how I'd bought a house big enough for all of us, utility bills addressed to me at an address Derek had never lived at or contributed to. I gathered photos spanning 10 years, birthday parties and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays, thousands of images showing a life built from daily presence, rather than occasional appearance. I compiled text messages and emails, the sparse communication from Derek over the years, promises made and broken, child support that never materialized, birthdays acknowledged days late or not at all. The journal I'd been keeping was harder to read through, page after page of my own handwriting documenting moments I'd thought I'd processed but apparently had just stored away. Lily's first day of kindergarten and how she'd cried for her daddy until I finally told her that sometimes people we love aren't able to be there, but that doesn't mean we're not loved, and how wrong it felt to have to explain abandonment to a 5-year-old. Noah's art show in 2nd grade where he'd painted a family portrait with 5 people instead of 6, and when his teacher asked about it, he'd said matter-of-factly that his dad was in Los Angeles so he wasn't really part of the family anymore. Sophie's championship soccer game where she'd scored the winning goal, and looked into the stands for her father before remembering he'd never been there for a single game. Ben's piano recital last month where he played a piece he'd been practicing for months and afterward asked if maybe this would be the thing that made his dad want to come back, as if his worthiness was measured by his ability to earn his father's presence. I typed it all into a document James could share with the court if needed, organized chronologically with supporting evidence cross-referenced. It grew to over 100 pages, a decade distilled into bullet points and dates and attached exhibits, and reading it made me realize how much we'd survived, how many moments of heartbreak we'd gotten through, how much strength it had taken to build something stable from rubble someone else had left behind. It also made me angry in a way I'd been suppressing, letting myself feel the full weight of Derek's selfishness, the audacity of thinking he could return and claim credit for survival he'd had no part in. The anger was clarifying, burning away doubt and fear and replacing them with absolute certainty that I would fight with everything I had, that I would not let him undo 10 years of love and stability because he'd decided it was convenient to be a father again. The meeting with James Whitmore took place in his office downtown, a converted warehouse space near the Pearl District with exposed brick and tall windows overlooking the city. Jordan came with me and we sat across from James's desk while he reviewed everything I'd compiled, occasionally making notes, asking clarifying questions, building the framework of our case. After nearly 2 hours, he leaned back in his chair and said we had one of the strongest abandonment patterns he'd seen, that the documentation was exceptional, that the children's ages and clear preferences would weigh heavily in any custody decision. But he also said that Derek hadn't done anything illegal, that absent fathers retained rights unless those rights were legally terminated, and that we needed to be prepared for the possibility that a judge might order some form of visitation or contact even if full custody remained with me. The words hit like cold water, the reality that we might not be able to completely prevent Derek from re-entering the kids' lives settling over us. James explained that family courts prioritize parental rights and family reunification, that even in cases of abandonment, judges often gave parents chances to rebuild relationships with their children. The best outcome we could realistically hope for was maintaining my primary custody, while potentially allowing Derek's supervised visitation that could be terminated if he failed to show up consistently, or if the children showed significant distress. The worst outcome was a judge deciding that Derek deserved a fresh start, and ordering a gradual transition toward shared custody. James said the latter was unlikely given the circumstances, but not impossible, and we needed to prepare for all possibilities. He asked if Derek had filed any paperwork yet, if we'd received any official notice of custody modification or visitation requests. I said no, that it had only been a week since the Sunday brunch confrontation, and as far as I knew Derek was still just making threats rather than taking action. James nodded and said that gave us time to file first, to control the narrative by requesting a formal determination of custody, rather than waiting for Derek to petition for modification. He said we should file for permanent guardianship or even adoption if the kids were open to it, forcing Derek to respond rather than attack. It was a strategic move, positioning me as someone seeking legal clarity about an existing reality, rather than someone defending against a challenge. I asked what would happen if Derek filed first, and James said it would make things more complicated but not impossible, that either way we had strong evidence and clear facts on our side. We discussed the kids testifying, whether they'd need to speak to a judge or a custody evaluator, how traumatic that might be and how to minimize harm while still ensuring their voices were heard. James said that at their ages, particularly Lily and Noah, their preferences would be given significant weight, but that they'd likely need to speak with a court-appointed guardian ad litem who would assess their well-being and relationships and make recommendations to the judge. He said the process could take months, that family court moved slowly, that we needed to be prepared for this to dominate our lives for a while. I asked what it would cost and he gave me a number that made my stomach clench, but I'd known this wouldn't be cheap, had been setting aside money in an emergency fund for years in case something like this happened. Jordan squeezed my hand and said we'd figure it out, that we'd take out loans if we needed to, that the kids were worth any cost. As we left James's office, walking through the Pearl District toward where we'd parked, I felt both more prepared and more frightened than I had before. Having a plan helped, knowing what steps to take and when to take them provided structure to chaos. But understanding the legal realities, the fact that Derek had rights simply because he was biologically their father regardless of how completely he'd abdicated his responsibilities, felt like being told the rules of a game where the deck was stacked against common sense. Jordan suggested we stop for coffee at a place we used to frequent before the kids came into our lives, back when we were young and unencumbered and could sit in cafes for hours just talking. We ordered and found a table by the window, watching Portland pass by in its typical November gray, people hurrying through rain that never quite stopped but never quite became a downpour either. Jordan asked how I was really doing, underneath the organization and planning and strategic thinking. I didn't have a simple answer. I was terrified and angry and exhausted, but also absolutely certain that we were right, that the life we'd built was worth protecting, that the kids deserved to choose their own relationships rather than having them forced on them by legal obligation. I said I kept thinking about that first morning 10 years ago, standing in my parents' living room surrounded by 4 children who needed me, having no idea how I'd make it work but knowing I couldn't walk away. I'd been so young, barely an adult myself, and taking on 4 kids had felt impossible until it became simply what life was. Now, facing the possibility of losing them to someone who'd never done the work of being present, I understood that I'd do it all over again, every sleepless night and financial struggle and moment of overwhelming responsibility, because they'd become the center of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined when this started. The first formal communication from Derek's attorney arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier to my office downtown. The envelope was thick, official-looking, the kind of mail that announces itself as trouble before you even open it. I waited until I got home to read it, wanting Jordan present, wanting to be in our space rather than at work when I processed whatever was inside. The kids were at their various activities, Lily at debate club, Noah at his art studio, Sophie at soccer practice, Ben at piano lessons, the carefully constructed schedule that kept our household functioning now feeling fragile, like all our routines might be temporary rather than permanent. Jordan sat beside me on the couch as I opened the envelope, their hand on my knee, steady presence in a moment that felt like standing on the edge of something steep. The letter was professionally composed, cold in its formality, outlining Derek's intention to petition the court for a modification of custody arrangements. It cited his biological relationship to the children, his recent stability and changed circumstances, his desire to exercise his parental rights and responsibilities. It acknowledged my guardianship but framed it as a temporary measure that had served its purpose and should now evolve into shared parenting that included Derek's active participation. The language was careful, never quite accusing me of anything but implying that I'd overstepped, that what had been necessary 10 years ago was now an impediment to the children's relationship with their father. It proposed a gradual reintroduction starting with supervised visits, progressing to unsupervised time, building toward alternating weeks and shared decision-making about education, medical care, and extracurricular activities. The timeline suggested this process would take approximately 6 months, after which Derek expected equal legal and physical custody. Reading it felt surreal, like someone had written fiction about my life using legal terminology. The letter mentioned the children by name but described them as though they were concepts rather than people, referring to their ages and grades but nothing about who they actually were, what they loved, what kept them awake at night, how they'd grown into themselves over 10 years of stability. There was no acknowledgement of Derek's absence, no recognition that he'd missed their entire childhoods, no explanation for why he deserved access to their futures when he'd abdicated responsibility for their pasts. The attached proposal for visitation was detailed and specific, outlining times and locations and rules for contact, treating relationship building like a business transaction with measurable benchmarks and predetermined outcomes. It made my skin crawl, this reduction of human connection to scheduled increments, as if love and trust could be manufactured through court-ordered exposure. Jordan read over my shoulder, their body tensing with each paragraph, and when we finished they said something I'd been thinking but hadn't articulated. They said the letter read like it was written for someone else, that the language and approach felt corporate, strategic in a way that didn't match Derek's personality or capabilities. This wasn't Derek's voice, wasn't his way of thinking or communicating. Someone was orchestrating this, providing the framework and the language and the strategy, and we both knew who that someone was. Vanessa Sterling, with her executive experience and her research into family law, and her vision of what their life should look like. A vision apparently that included instant children to complete the picture of success she'd curated. Derek was the vehicle for her desires, lending his biological connection to her acquisition of the family she wanted without the inconvenience of pregnancy or infant care, or the messy early years she'd skipped entirely. I forwarded the letter to James Whitmore immediately, scanning and emailing it with a subject line that probably revealed more desperation than I wanted to admit. He called within an hour, his voice calm in that way lawyers cultivate to counterbalance their clients' panic. He said the letter confirmed what we'd suspected, that Derek was moving forward with legal action, but that the content wasn't surprising or particularly threatening given what we knew about the case. The proposal was aggressive in its timeline and scope, but proposals weren't court orders, and no judge would grant equal custody to a parent who'd been absent for a decade without substantial evidence that such an arrangement served the children's best interests. James said we'd file our response within the week, formally requesting that my guardianship be converted to permanent custody with Derek, having no visitation rights unless and until he could demonstrate sustained commitment and the children expressed willingness to have contact with him. He said the letter actually helped our case because it revealed Derek's mindset, showing that he viewed this as a rights issue rather than a relationships issue, that he was focused on what he was entitled to rather than what the children needed. A good custody evaluator would see through that immediately, would recognize that Derek's interest was in winning rather than in actual parenting. James asked if I'd started compiling the character witnesses he'd requested, people who could testify to my relationship with the kids and Derek's absence over the years. I said I had a list started, teachers and coaches and neighbors, Mia who'd been present for countless dinners and bedtime routines and school events, my parents who could speak to the full timeline from Derek's departure to present day. He said we'd need affidavits from all of them, formal statements detailing specific observations and interactions, building a chorus of voices that all told the same story about presence and absence, stability and abandonment. That evening I sat down with the kids and showed them the letter, believing they deserved to know what was happening, rather than being protected from information that affected their lives. Lily read it carefully, her expression hardening with each paragraph, and when she finished she said with absolute certainty that she wouldn't comply with any court order requiring her to spend time with Derek, that she'd refuse and accept whatever consequences came from that refusal. I told her I appreciated her conviction but that we needed to work within the legal system rather than against it, that defying court orders would only make things more complicated. She said sometimes complications were worth it if they protected what mattered, and I heard myself in her words, the stubbornness that had carried me through 10 years of single parenting showing up in her teenage certainty about right and wrong. Noah asked what would happen if they told the judge they didn't want to see Derek, whether their opinions actually mattered or were just things adults pretended to care about before making decisions regardless. I said honestly that their voices would matter, that at their ages judges gave significant weight to their preferences, but that I couldn't guarantee the outcome would be what they wanted. Sophie said she didn't understand why someone could just leave and then come back and have rights, that it seemed like rights should be earned through showing up, and her confusion was legitimate because the logic of family law often contradicted the logic of lived experience. Ben asked the question that broke my heart, whether he'd have to call Derek Dad, whether using that word would mean he was betraying me, and pulled him close and told him that what he called people was his choice, that words only had the meaning we gave them, and Dad was a title earned through action not assigned through biology. We talked for over 2 hours, everyone processing differently, everyone needing different reassurances and having different fears. Lily wanted concrete information about legal processes and timelines, her need for control manifesting in her desire to understand every step of what was coming. Noah wanted to know if he'd have to talk to strangers about his feelings, if he'd be forced to explain his relationship with Derek to people who didn't know him and couldn't possibly understand the complexity of growing up with an absent father who was still technically alive and theoretically could have been present but chose not to be. Sophie wanted to know if we'd all stay together, if there was any scenario where they'd be split up, and I promised her that whatever happened, the 4 of them would remain together, that no court would separate siblings who'd been raised as a unit. Ben wanted to know if Jordan would still be there, if the person who'd been present for half his life was permanent or conditional, and Jordan answered that directly, saying nothing about this situation would change their commitment to being in his life, to being in all their lives for as long as they wanted that presence. After the kids went to bed, Jordan and I stayed up late working on the affidavit requests, drafting emails to everyone we'd identified as potential witnesses. We tried to strike a balance between explaining the situation and not overwhelming people with details, asking for their help while acknowledging the time and emotional labor we were requesting. Mia responded within minutes, saying she'd write a novel if it would help, that she'd testify in person if needed, that she'd been waiting 10 years to tell someone in authority exactly what she thought about Derek's choices. My parents took longer to respond, and when they did, Robert's email was brief but weighted with emotion, saying they'd do whatever was necessary to support us and the kids, that they'd failed Derek by enabling him but they wouldn't fail their grandchildren by staying silent about his abandonment. The responses came in over the next few days, teachers and coaches and neighbors all agreeing to provide statements, many of them expressing anger on our behalf, frustration at a system that gave rights to people who'd never exercised responsibilities. Lily's debate coach wrote a paragraph in her initial response about how she'd watched Lily flourish under stable guardianship, how she'd never once heard Lily mention her father except in the context of his absence, how it would be educational malpractice to disrupt a teenager's life during crucial college preparation years for the convenience of an adult who'd been absent by choice. Noah's art teacher sent a more measured response but included several observations about how Noah's work had evolved over the years she'd known him, how themes of stability and home and chosen family appeared consistently, how the few times he'd created pieces about his biological father they'd been marked by absence and negative space rather than presence and connection. Sophie's soccer coach provided specific examples of games and tournaments I'd attended, practices I'd helped with, team events where I'd volunteered, contrasting that with the complete absence of Derek at any team function over the years Sophie had been playing. He mentioned that Sophie had once asked him if it was normal to not have a dad at games if other kids noticed, and he told her that what was normal was having people who showed up for you, and she clearly had that even if the configuration looked different than traditional families. Ben's piano teacher wrote about how he'd progressed over the past 3 years, how I'd sat through lessons taking notes so I could help him practice at home, how Jordan had built him a practice space in our basement with soundproofing so he could play without disturbing the household, how the investment we'd made in his musical education was significant both financially and in terms of time and attention. She said she'd taught hundreds of students over her career and could always identify which ones had engaged parents versus which ones were there because it looked good on college applications, and Ben clearly fell into the former category. The affidavits took shape over 2 weeks, each one a window into different aspects of our lives, different moments of presence and absence, different examples of how family got built through daily actions rather than biological connection. Reading them was overwhelming, seeing our lives reflected through other people's observations, understanding how visible the work of parenting had been even when I'd felt like I was just barely keeping everything together. James compiled them into an exhibit for our filing, organizing them by category, witness by witness, building a narrative that was consistent and compelling and difficult to argue against. He said the strength of our case wasn't in any single document or statement but in the pattern they created collectively, the overwhelming evidence that over 10 years I'd done the work of parenting while Derek had done nothing, and that the children had thrived under my care in ways that suggested disrupting that stability would cause harm rather than benefit. While we prepared our legal response, Derek's presence in Portland became more apparent. He and Vanessa were apparently settling into their Lake Oswego house, posting about it on social media with the enthusiasm of people starting fresh. The house was impressive in a way that felt like overcompensation, too large for 2 people, clearly designed to accommodate a family that didn't yet exist or more accurately, existed elsewhere without their participation. Vanessa's post showed rooms being furnished and decorated, a home office for her remote work, a music studio for Derek that looked more like a stage set than a functional space. There were captions about new beginnings and building dreams and creating the life they'd always wanted, and the comments from their friends were universally supportive, congratulating them on the house and the relationship and their future together. No one apparently aware that the future they were planning involved children who already had a life that didn't include them. Derek started showing up at the kids' activities uninvited, standing at the edge of soccer fields or sitting in the back of piano recitals, not approaching but making his presence known. The first time it happened, Sophie called me from practice in tears, saying he was there watching her, that she felt like she couldn't breathe, that she wanted to leave but also didn't want to give him the satisfaction of disrupting her routine. I told her coach what was happening and he positioned himself between Derek and the field, making it clear through body language that Derek wasn't welcome closer. When practice ended, I was there to pick Sophie up, and Derek approached us in the parking lot, trying to talk to her, telling her he was proud of how well she played, as if pride was something he'd earned the right to express after missing every game of her soccer career. Sophie turned to him with a composure that surprised me, her voice steady despite the tears on her face, and told him that he didn't get to be proud, that pride was something you felt about people whose success you'd contributed to, and he'd contributed nothing to her life except absence. She said he could stand at her games if he wanted because they were public spaces, but she'd never acknowledge him, never speak to him, never pretend his presence meant anything except discomfort. Then she got in my car and we drove home in silence, her anger and pain filling the space between us, and I didn't try to fix it or minimize it, just let her feel what she needed to feel. That night she came into my room and asked if it was wrong to hate your father, if that made her a bad person, and I told her that hate was sometimes just hurt turned inside out, that she had every right to her feelings, that processing abandonment was complicated and nonlinear and she didn't need to forgive or forget or feel anything other than what was true for her. Derek showed up at Noah's art show at Madison High School, arriving just as the exhibition was opening, walking through the gallery like he had any right to be there. Noah's work was displayed throughout the space, pieces he'd created over the semester exploring themes of identity and belonging, several of them explicitly about the family we'd built and the absence of the one he'd been born into. There was a self-portrait titled Raised by Lions that showed Noah surrounded by protective figures, clearly me and Jordan and his siblings and his grandparents, creating a barrier between him and a shadowy figure in the background that didn't need a label to be understood. Derek stood in front of that piece for a long time, his expression unreadable, and I wondered if he recognized himself in the negative space, in the absence the painting made visible. Noah saw him and his whole body tensed, but he didn't leave or confront him, just continued talking with the other students and the teachers and the attendees who'd come to see the show. When Derek approached him trying to compliment the work, trying to insert himself into Noah's moment of achievement, Noah looked through him like he was transparent, like he didn't exist in any meaningful way, and continued his conversation with his art teacher as if Derek hadn't spoken. The dismissal was more powerful than anger would have been, more final, and I saw Derek's face change, saw him realize that he couldn't charm his way past a decade of absence, that these children weren't who he'd left, that they'd grown into people who'd made decisions about him based on his actions rather than his intentions. He left shortly after that, and Noah came over to me shaking slightly and said he thought seeing Derek would be harder, but actually it was just sad that someone could be so close to something meaningful and be completely unable to access it because they'd never done the work that access required. Lily's encounter with Derek happened at a coffee shop near her school, a place she went most afternoons to study and be away from the house for a few hours of adolescent independence. She was there with friends when Derek and Vanessa walked in, and unlike Noah, Lily didn't ignore them. She packed up her things and got ready to leave, but Derek blocked her path, not physically restraining her but positioning himself so she'd have to push past him to exit. He tried to talk to her, tried to explain that he understood she was angry, but that they needed to find a way forward, that he was her father regardless of the past and that meant something whether she wanted it to or not. Lily told him that fatherhood was a verb not a noun, that it required action not just biological connection, and he'd spent 16 years of her life demonstrating that he had no interest in the verb form of the relationship. Vanessa intervened then, trying to smooth things over with corporate diplomacy, suggesting they all sit down and talk like adults, that surely there was middle ground to be found. Lily turned to her with an expression I recognized, the one she wore in debate competitions when she'd identified a weak argument and was about to dismantle it, and said that Vanessa had no place in this conversation, that whatever relationship she thought she was building with Derek didn't give her rights to someone else's children, that she was a stranger who'd been dating their father for less than a year and thought that entitled her to access to their lives and their futures. She said it wasn't personal, it was just fact, and Vanessa's feelings about wanting a family didn't obligate them to become the family she wanted. Then Lily walked out, leaving Derek and Vanessa standing in the coffee shop while her friends gathered their things and followed her, loyal in the way teenagers are when one of their own has been threatened. When Lily got home and told me what happened, she was still vibrating with adrenaline and anger, replaying the conversation and analyzing whether she'd said the right things or been too harsh, or should have just ignored them entirely. I told her she'd done exactly what she needed to do, that setting boundaries with people who refused to respect them required strength and clarity, and she demonstrated both. But I also felt the weight of what was happening, the way Derek's return was forcing the kids into confrontations they shouldn't have to navigate, making them defend their right to choose who they had relationships with, putting them in positions where they had to articulate things that should have been obvious to any adult with basic emotional intelligence. They shouldn't have had to explain to their biological father why presence mattered more than genetics, why a decade of absence couldn't be erased by a few months of proximity, why love was earned through consistency rather than claimed through DNA. James filed our response to Derek's petition 3 weeks after we received his attorney's letter, a document that ran to nearly 40 pages not including exhibits and attachments. It laid out the full timeline of Derek's abandonment, documented every missed birthday and broken promise, included every affidavit and statement we'd collected, presented financial records showing the disparity between what I'd invested in the children's well-being and what Derek had contributed, which was effectively nothing. It argued that my guardianship should be converted to permanent custody, that Derek should be required to demonstrate sustained commitment and responsibility before being granted any access to the children, that the children's clearly expressed preferences should be given paramount consideration given their ages and the length of Derek's absence. It was comprehensive and devastating and absolutely truthful, and reading it in final form was both satisfying and sorrowful: satisfaction at having the full story told in formal terms, sorrow that we needed to tell it at all. Derek's attorney filed a response to our response, and the legal back and forth began, motions and countermotions, each side arguing their interpretation of the facts and the law. Derek's filings focused heavily on his biological relationship to the children, citing cases about parental rights and family reunification, arguing that his past mistakes shouldn't permanently sever his connection to his children, that people changed and deserved second chances, that the court should facilitate relationship building rather than preventing it. His attorney painted a picture of a man who'd struggled but overcome his struggles, who'd hit rock bottom but climbed back up, who was now stable and successful and ready to be the father he should have been all along. The narrative was compelling if you didn't look too closely at the details, if you didn't notice that his stability was less than a year old and depended entirely on his relationship with Vanessa, if you didn't question why his readiness to be a father coincided so perfectly with his girlfriend's desire to have an instant family. Our filings focused on the children, on their stability and well-being, on the harm that would come from disrupting their lives for the benefit of an adult who'd never prioritized their needs over his desires. We argued that Derek's rights had effectively been forfeited through abandonment, that 10 years of absence couldn't be undone through 6 months of proximity, that the children's clearly expressed unwillingness to have contact with him was a factor the court needed to respect rather than override. We presented evidence of Derek's pattern of instability, the bankruptcy, the frequent moves, the lack of consistent employment, the financial dependence on Vanessa that suggested his current stability was contingent rather than established. We questioned his motives, not directly accusing him of ulterior purposes but asking the court to consider whether his sudden interest in fatherhood was genuine or strategic, whether he was acting in the children's best interests or his own. The court appointed a guardian ad litem, an attorney named Sarah Chun whose job was to investigate the situation independently and make recommendations to the judge about what custody arrangement would serve the children's best interests. She reached out to schedule interviews with everyone involved, home visits to see where the children lived and where Derek proposed they might eventually spend time, conversations with teachers and coaches and anyone else who had relevant observations about the family dynamics. The kids were anxious about meeting her, worried about saying the wrong thing or being judged for their feelings, but I told them the truth was the only strategy we needed, that pretending or performing would only make things more complicated. Sarah seemed competent and compassionate when we first spoke on the phone, explaining her process and her role, emphasizing that she was there to be the children's voice in the proceedings, to make sure their perspectives were heard and weighted appropriately. Her first visit to our house lasted 3 hours, walking through each room, observing how we interacted, asking questions that seemed casual, but were clearly designed to reveal patterns and dynamics. She noticed the photos on the walls spanning a decade, the artwork the kids had created displayed throughout the house, the piano in the living room and the art supplies in the basement, and the soccer trophies on shelves in Sophie's room. She saw the chore chart on the refrigerator and the family calendar in the kitchen with everyone's activities color-coded, the organization that made managing 5 people's schedules possible. She observed Jordan and me together, how we communicated and divided responsibilities, how the kids interacted with both of us, the ease that came from years of established patterns and mutual respect. She asked the kids about their daily routines, their friends, their schools, their plans for the future, and they answered honestly, describing a life that was full and stable and supported. Then she asked about Derek, and the energy in the room changed, the kids becoming more guarded, more careful with their words. Lily spoke first, articulating clearly that she had no interest in a relationship with someone who'd been absent by choice, that she was 16 and capable of deciding who she wanted in her life, and Derek wasn't someone she'd choose regardless of biological connection. Noah explained through the lens of his art, talking about how absence had shaped his understanding of family, how he'd learned that presence was what mattered, that showing up consistently was the foundation of trust, and Derek had never built that foundation, so there was nothing to build on now. Sophie was more emotional, saying she didn't understand why they had to explain this to adults, why it wasn't obvious that you couldn't leave for 10 years and expect to come back to love and trust and relationship, that those things didn't just exist in stasis waiting for someone to claim them. Ben said quietly that he didn't remember Derek at all, that Maya was his parent in every way that mattered, and the idea of spending time with a stranger just because that stranger was his biological father made him feel scared and confused. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes, her expression neutral but her eyes revealing that she was hearing what they said and understanding the weight of it. She asked if anyone had pressured them to say these things, if they felt free to express their true feelings, or were worried about consequences for being honest. They all said no, that I'd told them to be truthful, that their feelings were valid regardless of what anyone else thought they should feel. She asked if they'd be willing to give Derek a chance if the court ordered it, if they could imagine any scenario where contact with him might be something they'd participate in willingly. Lily said flatly that she'd comply with court orders because she wasn't going to get herself in legal trouble, but compliance wasn't the same as willing participation, and no judge could order her to feel or express affection she didn't have. The others echoed similar sentiments, varying levels of willingness to physically show up, but absolute unwillingness to pretend that presence equaled relationship. Sarah's visit to Derek and Vanessa's house happened the following week, and while I wasn't present for it, James got a report from Derek's attorney about how it went. Apparently they'd prepared extensively, the house staged like a model home, rooms designated for each child with furniture and decorations purchased specifically for the guardian ad litem's visit. Evidence of planning for a future that didn't yet exist and might never. Vanessa had apparently done most of the talking, describing their vision for blended family life, the activities they'd planned, the ways they'd integrate the children into their household gradually and thoughtfully. Derek had tried to express emotion about missing his children's lives, about wanting to make amends and build something new, but according to James's source his performance had felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script Vanessa had written rather than speaking from genuine feeling. Sarah interviewed them separately as well, asking Derek specific questions about the children that he apparently struggled to answer. He didn't know what grades they were in, couldn't name their teachers or their friends, didn't know what subjects they excelled in or struggled with, couldn't describe their personalities or their interests with any specificity. When pressed about why he'd been absent for so long, his answers were vague, talking about personal struggles and timing not being right, never taking full responsibility for abandonment, never acknowledging that his choices had been selfish and harmful. When asked what had changed to make him ready now, he talked about Vanessa, about how meeting her had given him stability and purpose, essentially admitting that his interest in fatherhood was connected to his romantic relationship rather than to any internal growth or genuine desire to know his children. Sarah's questions to Vanessa were apparently more pointed, asking about her motivations, her understanding of the children's perspectives, her willingness to accept that they might never want the relationship she was envisioning. The preliminary report Sarah submitted to the court wasn't made available to us directly, but James had contacts who gave him the general outline of her recommendations. She'd found that the children were thriving in my care, that they lived in a stable, loving environment with clear routines and strong support systems, that disrupting their lives would cause significant harm without clear corresponding benefit. She'd noted their ages and their strongly expressed preferences, emphasizing that they weren't young children who could be transitioned through gradual exposure, but teenagers with clear identities and firm boundaries about who they wanted in their lives. She'd observed that Derek's interest in fatherhood appeared contingent on his relationship with Vanessa rather than stemming from genuine desire to know his children as individuals, that his knowledge of them was superficial at best, that his planning for their integration into his life was more about what he wanted than what they needed. Her recommendation, according to James's sources, was that my custody should remain primary and exclusive, that Derek should not be granted visitation rights at this time, but that the door should remain open for future modification if Derek could demonstrate sustained commitment over a period of years, and if the children at that point expressed willingness to have contact with him. She suggested Derek might benefit from therapy to address why he'd abandoned his responsibilities, and what had really prompted his return, whether his motivations were about the children or about his own needs and desires. She noted that Vanessa's role in pushing for custody was concerning, that her desire for instant family shouldn't supersede the children's right to choose their relationships, that adults needed to prioritize children's well-being over their own wants. The report was apparently thorough and well-reasoned, and James said it was exactly the kind of recommendation we'd hoped for, strongly in our favor while still acknowledging Derek's theoretical rights as a biological parent. Derek's response to the preliminary report was predictable, his attorney filing objections and requesting additional evaluation, arguing that Sarah had been biased, that she'd given too much weight to the children's current feelings without considering their long-term need for paternal relationship, that she'd failed to adequately consider Derek's rights as a parent. The objections felt desperate. Grasping at procedural, the hearing was scheduled for a gray Tuesday in March, 6 months after Derek had walked back into our lives with his rehearsed contrition and his expensive lawyer. The Multnomah County Courthouse downtown felt imposing in the way government buildings do. All marble and echoes and the weight of decisions being made that would alter lives in ways that couldn't be undone. We arrived early, James wanting us settled and calm before proceedings began, and we sat on wooden benches in the hallway while other families cycled through their own crises and resolutions. The kids were dressed formally, Lily in a blazer she'd borrowed from a friend, Noah in the button-down shirt he usually saved for art openings, Sophie in clothes that made her look older than 12, Ben in slacks that we'd had to buy because he'd outgrown everything appropriate in his closet. They sat close together, that familiar configuration of protection and solidarity, and I wondered not for the first time what it did to children to have to defend their right to stability in a courtroom. Derek arrived with Vanessa and his attorney precisely 15 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, cutting it close in a way that felt intentional, creating urgency that might work in his favor. He dressed carefully, a suit that was expensive without being ostentatious, his hair trimmed and styled, his expression practiced somewhere between humble and hopeful. Vanessa wore designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, perfectly tailored and utterly professional, playing the role of supportive partner with the dedication of someone who understood that appearances mattered in places like this. She carried a leather portfolio, notes and documents organized with the precision of someone who'd built a career on preparation and presentation. Derek's attorney was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a reputation for winning difficult custody cases, someone who specialized in parental rights and knew how to frame abandonment as temporary absence and selfishness as self-discovery. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, less dramatic than television had led me to believe, just a judge's bench and tables for attorneys and wooden benches for observers. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a woman in her 60s who'd been on the family court bench for 20 years, and had a reputation for being fair but tough, unwilling to tolerate manipulation or half-truths from either side. She reviewed the files in front of her while we took our seats, James and I at one table, Derek and his attorney at the other, the kids sitting behind us with Jordan and my parents providing physical and emotional support. The court reporter prepared her equipment, and a bailiff stood by the door, and the mundane administrative details of justice unfolded while my heart hammered against my ribs hard enough that I wondered if everyone could hear it. Judge Morrison began by outlining the purpose of the hearing, reviewing the custody modification petition Derek had filed and the response we'd submitted requesting that my guardianship be converted to permanent custody. She noted Sarah Chen's report and the strong recommendation it contained, but emphasized that she'd be making her own determination based on all the evidence presented, that guardian ad litem reports were advisory but not binding. She asked Derek's attorney to present their case first, giving Derek the opportunity to explain why he believed shared custody was in the children's best interests, and what had changed to make him capable of parenting after a decade of absence. The attorney stood and launched into an opening statement that painted Derek as a man who'd made mistakes but had done the hard work of personal growth, who'd recognized his failures and addressed them, who'd achieved the stability necessary to be a present and engaged father. She talked about his relationship with Vanessa as evidence of his ability to maintain commitment, conveniently ignoring that the relationship was less than a year old and hardly proof of long-term stability. She cited his financial resources, the house in Lake Oswego, his current employment situation, presenting material stability as though it were equivalent to emotional capacity. She acknowledged his absence but framed it as a period of necessary self-improvement, suggesting that removing himself from his children's lives when he was struggling had actually been a responsible choice rather than an abandonment. She argued that children needed their fathers, that biological connections mattered, that Derek's willingness to fight for custody demonstrated his commitment and his readiness. She requested a gradual transition starting with supervised visitation and building toward equal custody, asking the court to give Derek the chance to prove himself rather than permanently severing his parental rights based on past behavior. When she finished, Judge Morrison asked Derek to testify, and he took the stand with visible nervousness that might have been genuine or might have been performance. Under his attorney's questioning, he told his version of the story, how he'd been young and overwhelmed when his girlfriend left, how he'd panicked and made the wrong choice to leave rather than stay and struggle through, how he'd spent years trying to become someone worthy of being their father. He talked about therapy and self-reflection with the vocabulary of someone who'd been coached on what judges wanted to hear, mentioning accountability and growth and change perspectives. He described meeting Vanessa and finding stability, how her presence in his life had given him the foundation he'd lacked before, how together they'd created a home that had room for his children. He said he thought about them every day, that not being part of their lives had been agonizing, that he wanted the chance to make amends and build relationships he should have nurtured all along. James cross-examined him with the precision of someone who'd prepared extensively and knew exactly where the weaknesses in Derek's testimony lay. He asked Derek to name the children's teachers, and Derek stumbled, admitting he didn't know but that he'd learn once he had access to them. James asked about their interests and hobbies, and Derek gave vague answers that could have applied to any teenagers rather than specific knowledge about his specific children. James asked why Derek had sent only 4 checks totaling less than $3,000 over 10 years, why he'd missed birthdays and holidays consistently, why his phone calls had been so irregular as to be effectively non-existent. Derek's answers were defensive, blaming changed phone numbers and returned mail and difficulties finding work, excuses that might have been partially true but didn't account for the complete abdication of responsibility. James asked about the bankruptcy filing 3 years ago, the pattern of unstable employment, the frequent moves, asking how any of that demonstrated the stability Derek now claimed to have achieved. The most devastating moment came when James asked Derek to describe each child's personality, their strengths and challenges, what made them unique as individuals. Derek struggled visibly, giving generic descriptions that could have fit any children rather than his children, revealing that he didn't actually know them at all. He talked about Lily being smart and Noah being artistic and Sophie being athletic and Ben being musical, surface observations that anyone could have gleaned from a brief conversation, nothing that showed actual knowledge or relationship. When James asked when he'd last had a meaningful conversation with any of them, Derek admitted he hadn't, that they'd refused to engage with him when he tried to reach out, but the phrasing revealed what he didn't seem to realize, that he viewed their rejection as the obstacle rather than recognizing it as the consequence of his choices. Judge Morrison's expression throughout this testimony remained neutral, but I saw her taking extensive notes, and I knew she was hearing what we heard, the fundamental disconnect between Derek's claims about wanting to be a father and his actual understanding of what fatherhood required. Vanessa testified next, called by Derek's attorney to speak to their stable home and their readiness to parent. She was polished and articulate, describing the house they'd prepared and the vision they had for integrating the children into their lives, the activities they'd planned and the ways they'd support the kids' interests and education. She talked about her own stable career, her financial resources, her desire to be part of the children's lives not as a replacement for me, but as an addition, another supportive adult who could offer different perspectives and opportunities. Her testimony was compelling on the surface, but under James's cross-examination the cracks began to show. He asked how long she'd been with Derek, and she admitted it was 11 months. He asked if she had any experience with children, any nieces or nephews or prior relationships that had involved parenting, and she said no, this would be new for her but she'd been researching and preparing. James asked if the children knew her at all, if she'd had any interactions with them beyond the one Sunday brunch, and she admitted they hadn't been receptive to her attempts at connection. The question that exposed the most came when James asked why she wanted to be part of the children's lives given that they'd made it clear they weren't interested in a relationship with her or with Derek. Vanessa's answer revealed everything we'd suspected, that this was about what she wanted rather than what the children needed. She talked about building a family, about how she'd always envisioned having children but her career had taken priority, and now she was 42 and traditional paths to motherhood felt less viable, and Derek's children represented an opportunity to have the family experience she wanted without starting from infancy. She said this like it was reasonable, like children were interchangeable components in her life plan rather than human beings with their own autonomy and preferences. Judge Morrison's expression finally shifted, a subtle tightening around her mouth that suggested Vanessa had just confirmed something the judge had suspected, but needed to hear stated explicitly. My testimony came next and I'd been dreading it because talking about the last 10 years meant revisiting every difficult moment, every night I'd cried in the shower so the kids wouldn't hear, every time I'd stretched a dollar further than seemed possible, every sacrifice that had felt enormous in the moment but insignificant compared to what the kids needed. James walked me through the timeline methodically, establishing when Derek left, how I'd stepped in, the legal guardianship process, the decade of daily parenting that followed. I described the house in Selwood and how we'd made it a home, the routines we'd established, the way we'd built a life that worked for all 5 of us and then 6 when Jordan moved in. I talked about the kids' achievements and their struggles, the parent-teacher conferences and the doctor's appointments and the late-night conversations about homework and heartbreak and everything in between. I presented the financial records showing what I'd invested in their well-being, not to emphasize money but to demonstrate commitment, the tangible evidence of showing up consistently over time. Under cross-examination, Derek's attorney tried to paint me as someone who'd overstepped, who'd used Derek's temporary absence to permanently insert myself between him and his children, who'd turned them against him through years of subtle influence. She suggested I'd encouraged their rejection of him, that I had a vested interest in maintaining exclusive custody, that my refusal to facilitate contact between Derek and the children over the years had damaged relationships that might otherwise have been salvageable. I answered as calmly as I could, explaining that Derek had never asked for contact, never tried to maintain relationships, never sent letters or gifts or made any effort that I could have either facilitated or prevented. I said I'd never spoken negatively about him to the children, that I'd answered their questions honestly but hadn't volunteered criticism, that their feelings about him had formed through his absence rather than through anything I'd said. I pointed out that at their current ages, they were capable of forming their own opinions and making their own choices, that my influence over their relationships was minimal compared to their own lived experience of abandonment. The children testified individually, each meeting privately with Judge Morrison in her chambers rather than in open court, a protection for their privacy and their emotional well-being. Sarah Chun sat in on the conversations, and James was allowed to be present as my attorney, but Derek and Vanessa and the general public were excluded. I wasn't allowed in either, had to sit in the courtroom waiting while each child spent 30 to 45 minutes talking with the judge, trusting that they'd express themselves clearly and honestly without me there to support or guide them. Lily went first, and when she emerged 40 minutes later she looked exhausted but composed, giving me a tight nod that suggested it had gone as well as it could. Noah followed, then Sophie, then Ben, each of them disappearing behind the judge's chamber's door and emerging later looking drained but relieved to have their voices heard. Later, James told me what he could about the conversations, limited by confidentiality, but able to share general impressions. He said Lily had been articulate and firm, making it clear that she was almost 17 and capable of deciding who she wanted in her life, that Derek's biological connection meant nothing compared to 10 years of absence, that forcing contact with him would damage her senior year and her mental health. Noah had apparently spoken about family in more abstract terms, talking about how presence and consistency created bonds, how absence created voids, how you couldn't build a relationship on nothing no matter how much someone wanted to retroactively claim one. Sophie had been more emotional but equally clear, saying she didn't feel safe with someone she didn't know, that Derek was a stranger regardless of DNA, that being forced to spend time with him would feel like punishment for something she hadn't done wrong. Ben had told the judge he was scared, that he didn't understand why adults thought he should want to know someone who'd never wanted to know him, that Maya was his parent in every way that mattered and changing that would break something he didn't know how to fix. Judge Morrison's questions to them had apparently been gentle but probing, asking not just what they wanted but why, making sure their preferences were their own rather than programmed, ensuring they understood the permanence of their choices. She'd asked if they'd be willing to try even supervised visits, even letters or phone calls as first steps, giving Derek any pathway to relationship building. They'd all said no with varying degrees of firmness, that they didn't want contact in any form, that they'd reached their conclusions through years of his absence rather than through any single moment, that nothing he could say or do now would change the fundamental reality that he'd chosen not to be their father when being their father would have mattered. James said the judge had seemed to hear them, really hear them, that her question suggested she understood the difference between children being stubborn and children protecting themselves from harm. The expert witnesses came next, child psychologists who'd reviewed the case files and offered opinions about the potential impact of various custody arrangements. Our expert, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, had evaluated the children and testified that they were well-adjusted teenagers with strong attachments to me and to each other, that their home environment was stable and nurturing, that disrupting their lives would cause psychological harm without corresponding benefit. She'd noted that forced contact with Derek would likely increase anxiety and resentment, potentially damaging the children's ability to form healthy relationships in the future, teaching them that their boundaries didn't matter and their preferences could be overridden by adults' desires. She'd emphasized that at their ages, particularly Lily and Noah as teenagers, forcing unwanted parental contact could lead to resistance and rebellion, potentially causing them to act out in ways that would harm their academic performance and their emotional well-being. Derek's expert, Dr. Michael Foster, argued that children needed fathers regardless of past absence, that biological connections had psychological significance, that Derek deserved the opportunity to build relationships with his children, even if those relationships started from difficult places. He testified without having met the children, basing his opinions on research about father absence and the importance of paternal involvement, applying general principles to our specific situation without accounting for the particulars. Under James's cross-examination, he'd admitted he hadn't spoken with the children, hadn't visited either home, hadn't reviewed the extensive documentation of Derek's absence in my presence, was essentially offering theoretical opinions about an idealized situation rather than practical guidance about our actual circumstances. His credibility diminished with each admission, revealing that Derek's team had brought him in to say what they needed said, rather than to provide genuine expertise about what would serve these specific children's best interests. The closing argument stretched into the late afternoon, Derek's attorney making one final appeal for second chances and biological rights, and the importance of paternal relationships, James methodically reviewing the evidence and emphasizing the children's voices and their right to stability, and their clear articulation of harm that would come from forced contact with Derek. Judge Morrison listened to both sides without interrupting, her expression thoughtful, her notes extensive. When the arguments concluded, she said she'd take the matter under advisement, that custody decisions required careful consideration, and she wanted time to review all the evidence and testimony thoroughly. She said we'd receive her written decision within 30 days, that both parties should refrain from contact with each other during that period, that the children should be allowed to continue their normal routines without disruption while she deliberated. The waiting was excruciating, worse than the hearing itself because at least during the hearing there was action and forward motion. The 30 days stretched like months, every morning waking up wondering if today would be the day, every time my phone rang checking if it was James with news. The kids tried to continue normally, attending school and their activities, but the uncertainty hung over all of us like whether we couldn't escape. Lily threw herself into college applications, using the distraction of essays and deadlines to avoid thinking about what might happen if the judge ruled against us. Noah painted compulsively, filling canvases with images that grew progressively darker as the days passed. Sophie's soccer performance suffered, her coach pulling me aside to ask if everything was okay at home, if there was something he should know about that was affecting her play. Ben had nightmares again, the same ones from when Derek first returned, waking up convinced he was being taken away and needing reassurance that he was safe, that he was home, that nothing had changed yet. Jordan held us together through those weeks, managing logistics and providing emotional support, and being the steady presence that allowed me to fall apart when I needed to without the kids seeing. Mia checked in daily, offering to take the kids for activities or outings, giving them breaks from the tension that filled our house despite our best efforts to contain it. My parents struggled with their own guilt and grief, Robert particularly wrestling with the role they played in creating Derek's sense of entitlement, Patricia mourning the son she'd thought she'd raised versus the man he'd become. We gathered for Sunday dinners still, maintaining the tradition even though Derek's absence from it was more noticeable now than it had been before his return, the ghost of him haunting the empty chair in ways his actual absence never had. The decision arrived on a Thursday, 27 days after the hearing, delivered via email from the court with a copy sent to both attorneys. James called me immediately, his voice carrying relief I could hear before he said anything substantive. He read me the relevant portions, Judge Morrison's carefully worded ruling that granted my petition for permanent custody, denied Derek's request for visitation, and terminated his parental rights pending his right to appeal. The decision was thorough, referencing Sarah Chen's report extensively, quoting from the children's testimony about their clearly expressed preferences and their articulated reasons for those preferences, noting the decade of abandonment and the lack of evidence that Derek had any genuine relationship with the children or understanding of their needs as individuals. Judge Morrison had written that while parental rights were significant, they weren't absolute, that the court's primary obligation was to the children's well-being rather than to parents' desires, that 10 years of absence had effectively severed whatever bond might have existed through biology alone. She'd noted that the children were old enough to have valid voices in custody decisions, that their unanimous rejection of contact with Derek wasn't stubbornness but self-protection, that forcing them into relationship with someone they experienced as a threat to their stability would cause harm the court was unwilling to inflict. She'd been particularly critical of Vanessa's testimony, noting that the desire to acquire ready-made children to fulfill personal family fantasies was not a valid reason to disrupt those children's established lives, that children were not accessories to adult relationships but individuals with their own rights to choose their connections. The decision addressed Derek's claims about wanting to make amends by noting that amends were made through sustained action over time, not through legal force, That if he genuinely cared about his children's well-being, he would respect their boundaries rather than violating them through court orders. She'd written that his absence of knowledge about basic facts of their lives, his inability to describe their personalities or interests with any specificity, his defensive responses to questions about his abandonment all suggested that his interest was in asserting rights rather than building relationships. The ruling concluded by stating that my guardianship was converted to permanent custody, that I had sole legal and physical custody of all 4 children, that Derek's parental rights were terminated with prejudice, meaning he couldn't petition for modification without showing substantial change in circumstances and, without the children expressing willingness to have contact with him, neither of which seemed likely given the current situation. I read the full decision 3 times, alone in my car in the parking lot of my office building, tears streaming down my face, a decade of fear and fighting and fierce protection finally releasing in sobs that shook my whole body. We'd won. The kids were safe. Derek couldn't take them, couldn't force contact, couldn't disrupt the life we'd built through 10 years of showing up every single day. I called Jordan first, barely able to speak through crying, and they said they'd leave work immediately, would pick up the kids from school early, would meet me at home so we could tell them together. I called my parents next, Robert answering and his voice breaking when I told him, Patricia taking the phone and crying so hard she couldn't speak, both of them carrying guilt they didn't need to carry but would anyway because that's what parents did even when their children were adults making their own terrible choices. We gathered in the living room of our Selwood house, the 5 of us and Jordan and my parents, and I read the decision aloud to the kids, letting them hear Judge Morrison's words about their voices matching, their preferences being valid, their right to choose their relationships being respected. Lily cried, something she rarely allowed herself, and said she'd been so scared that being right wouldn't matter, that biology would win over everything else, that she'd have to spend her senior year being forced into relationship with someone she didn't know and didn't want to know. Noah said he felt like he could breathe for the first time in months, that the weight he'd been carrying had been crushing and now suddenly it was gone. Sophie asked if it was really over, if Derek couldn't come back and try again, and I told her honestly that he could appeal but that Judge Morrison's decision was thorough and well-reasoned and unlikely to be overturned, that we were as safe as we could be within the legal system. Ben climbed into my lap despite being too big for it, and said quietly that he was glad he could keep calling me what he'd always called me, that changing it would have felt like losing himself. Derek's attorney filed a notice of appeal 2 weeks later. Predictable but ultimately futile. The appeals court upheld Judge Morrison's decision 6 months later without much deliberation, noting in their brief ruling that the trial court had properly weighed all factors and reached a reasonable conclusion supported by substantial evidence. Derek and Vanessa's social media went quiet after that. No more posts about building family or second chances. Their Lake Oswego house apparently sold within the year based on public records I checked, not because I was looking for them but because I needed to know they'd moved on. I heard through my parents that Derek and Vanessa had broken up, that she'd apparently decided instant family through complicated custody battles wasn't the path she wanted after all, that Derek had moved back to Los Angeles or maybe Seattle, the details vague because my parents had stopped tracking him too, finally releasing themselves from the obligation of knowing where their son was or what he was doing. Life returned to something approximating normal, or maybe it created a new normal that was actually better than what we'd had before because the threat that had been lurking was now definitively gone. Lily graduated high school with honors and got accepted to University of Oregon with a scholarship, planning to study education like she'd always said she would. Noah's art was featured in a citywide youth exhibition, and a local gallery owner expressed interest in representing him when he was old enough, telling him he had a perspective that deserved larger audiences. Sophie's soccer team won the state championship, and she scored the winning goal. And this time when she looked into the stands she saw everyone who mattered already there cheering for her. Ben performed a piano solo at a recital downtown, playing a piece he'd composed himself that was haunting and beautiful and entirely his own creation. Jordan and I got married on a Saturday in June, a small ceremony in our backyard with the kids standing up with us, Lily reading a poem she'd written about chosen family, Noah creating the invitations and decorations, Sophie and Ben walking us down the aisle because the traditional structure didn't fit our unconventional path to this moment. Patricia and Robert cried through the entire ceremony. Happy tears this time, celebrating what we'd built rather than mourning what Derek had destroyed. Mia gave a toast at the reception about witnessing our family form and grow, about how love was a verb not a feeling, about how every day for 10 years she'd watched us choose each other, And that was what made us family regardless of what any legal document said. The adoption papers were filed a year after the custody decision, a legal formality more than anything since I'd been their parent in every meaningful way for over a decade. But having it official mattered to the kids, particularly Ben, who'd never known anything else but wanted the documentation that matched his reality. The judge who presided over the adoption hearing was different from Judge Morrison, but she clearly read the case history and understood what this moment meant. She asked each child individually if this was what they wanted, if they understood that adoption meant permanent legal relationship, if they had any questions or concerns. They each said yes without hesitation, and when she signed the orders making it official, making me legally and permanently their mother, the four of them tackled me in a group hug that knocked me backwards into Jordan and sent all six of us tumbling into a heap of laughter and tears and overwhelming relief. The years continued to unfold, ordinary and extraordinary all at once, college acceptances and graduation ceremonies, first jobs and first apartments, relationships that started and some that ended and some that evolved into permanence. Lily became a teacher like she'd planned, working with struggling students in a Title I school, bringing the same fierce advocacy to her classroom that she developed protecting her siblings. Noah's art career took off slowly then suddenly, his work appearing in galleries across the Pacific Northwest, his perspective on family and belonging resonating with audiences who'd lived their own versions of chosen connection. Sophie got a soccer scholarship to Portland State, studying sports medicine and planning to work with youth athletes, giving back to the community that had supported her through difficult years. Ben studied music composition, creating scores that were used in independent films and theater productions, his talent nurtured by a decade of having the space and support to develop it. We stayed in the Selwood house the craftsman eyed, bought when they were young, gradually filling with new memories that layered over old ones, renovations and updates marking time's passage, but the foundation remaining solid. The kids moved out eventually the way kids do when they become adults, but they came back for Sunday dinners, bringing partners and eventually children of their own, the family expanding in ways I never could have imagined that first morning when Derek left and I thought I was just filling a temporary gap. Patricia and Robert aged into their 80s, slowing down but still present for every birthday and holiday and ordinary Tuesday, their role as grandparents the redemption they'd sought for their failures as Derek's parents. Derek himself became a ghost, someone we'd known once but who'd removed himself so completely from our lives that he existed only in origin stories, the biological father who'd given them life but not much else. The kids occasionally got curious about him as they got older, searching social media or asking their grandparents if they'd heard anything, but the curiosity was academic rather than emotional, wanting to know what had become of him without wanting him to become part of their lives. I heard eventually that he'd married someone else, had more children, hopefully was present for them in ways he'd never been for his first four. I didn't wish him ill, didn't carry anger anymore, just a mild sadness for what he'd missed, for the remarkable humans he could have known if he'd been capable of showing up. The story people tell about us now is one of resilience and chosen family, of how blood doesn't determine bonds and presence creates permanence. We became the example people cited when they needed evidence that families could be built from love rather than biology, that abandonment didn't have to define futures, that children could thrive when the adults in their lives prioritized their well-being over their own egos. I never set out to be inspirational, never wanted our struggle to become a narrative others consumed, but if telling our story helped someone else navigate similar terrain, made someone else feel less alone in the complicated work of building family from fragments, then maybe the pain had purpose beyond just our survival. What I learned through all of it was that family wasn't something you were born into but something you built through 10,000 small choices, through showing up when it was hard and staying when it would have been easier to leave, through choosing love as an action rather than a feeling. I learned that children were resilient but they shouldn't have to be, that survival wasn't the same as thriving, that adults had an obligation to make children's lives easier rather than harder. I learned that legal systems could get it right sometimes, that judges and lawyers and guardian ad litems could see through manipulation and prioritize what mattered, that justice existed even if it took longer to arrive than seemed fair. Most importantly, I learned that the best inheritance I could give the kids wasn't money or property or even stability, though all of those mattered, but the absolute certainty that they were loved, that they were chosen, that they deserved adults who showed up for them consistently and unconditionally, and that truth was always worth fighting for no matter how long the fight took. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.